Okay, we'll talk about word meaning, artifact mediation, dual stimulation eventually. It brings us to the question of signs and tools. Now, I've been doing a bit of investigation into signs and tools over the past couple of weeks. It was one of the things I really had to get my head around before coming in front of this group. And the story turns out to be different than what I realised. Until about 1931, Vygotsky paid no attention to speech. Almost no attention to it. He did use interviews with people and what they said as a means of accessing what they thought, but it was not a significant part of his theoretical apparatus. He started off with signs and tools, and a tool is to be understood pretty well literally as an object that an object of human labour that one uses to act on nature. What a sign was the archetypal sign is the written word. Right? So the sign arose because Vygotsky developed a view that the formation of civilization and modern human life arose from the discovery of writing, formed that as a view. And that therefore a critical point in human history was the emergence of writing. And therefore, in the same way he was interested in apes who had the rudiments of tool use, and that led to the development of the human species. He was interested in that point in history when the rudiments of writing appeared. And he discovered the rudiments of writing in people that used signs, such as tying a knot in a bit of string or a knot in your handkerchief, or make little sort of dolls to remind you of someone or something. And he took them to be the rudiments of signs. Now, a sign, in the sense that Vygotsky was using it up until 1931, would include a computer. A computer would be described as a sign. Right? The archetypal, he introduced the term around 1930 as of a psychological tool or a technical tool, which is somewhat more appropriate, right? Because it seems silly to call a computer a sign. Oops, cramp, excuse me. Oh. Drink more water, excuse me. Seems silly to call a computer a sign. You understand a written word being a sign, and by extension a book, and you can understand a map, for instance, or a diagram being extensions of that, but it seemed to be going too far to call it a computer. He didn't have computers, but until he introduced the terminology of technical and psychological tools, and a computer would have been a sign. That's very confusing, really, in the light of the fact that in 1934, when Vygotsky wrote Thinking and Speech, which really is why we remember him, right? He made important discoveries along the road to writing Thinking and Speech, but they're not things that would have really made him as important as he is. And there are a lot of problems in his earlier writings, such as this one on primitive man, ape, primitive man and child, right? Things that he changed his mind about quite dramatically between writing that in 1929 and about 1931. Now, some of the things he says in his latter times about tools and signs and actions and words have to be taken in the light of his own change of mind and in the light of the schools of psychological thought which he's conflicting with, right? So, for example, he expresses himself very much against the idea of taking speech as a form of action. He says if you say speech is a form of uttering a word as an action, you say you're not understanding what an action is. right? Now I'm making a decision to use terminology that I think is appropriate to where Vygotsky ended up in, and is appropriate to the intellectual environment we're in today. We're not fighting the demons of 1934, we're fighting the demons of 2014. So this has to be taken into account. If you do the reading and follow these links on the PowerPoint, you'll come across things that seem to directly contradict what I'm saying here. And that's why I really had to put a lot of time into reading this over and understanding why Vygotsky was saying these things. Right? And as we're talking through this, I'll make reference to these, but that needs to be said. So I will say a spoken word is a sign, just as much as a written word. But it's not a sign in the same sense, because speech was around from the very beginning of the human species. Yeah? That Vygotsky says that in the beginning was the deed, but in the beginning was the deed. Right? The Bible says that in the beginning was the word. Right? Goethe said, that in the beginning was the deed. Right? And Vygotsky says, yeah, okay, in the beginning was the deed, but after that came the word. Right? And you remember that the double spiral diagram I've given you. This applies in the relation here. That as soon as human beings began to make tools, language came into being. You create something. Where's that stick, my poking stick? There it is. As soon as you are making things out of nature, then they get names, right? And the cooperative labour that's involved in tool making generates language, arises out of that. Right? So it's agreed, if you like, the anthropologists or archaeologists or whatever, agree that tool making and language arose at the same time, in the earliest times of the emergence of the human species. And there's arguments about which came first. And Vygotsky, along with the Marxism of his time and now, says, well, the priority goes to the deed, that is to say, the tool making. And the activity of tool making generated the need for language. And of course the whole physiology changed, the whole position of the head, the throat, all these things, the hand had to change. There were huge physiological changes, and the evidence is that the physiological changes around the larynx and so on went side by side with the changes in the hands. Right? The changes in the hands are to do with the making and use of tools and the fine motor skills that we develop for tool handling. They go along with the very fine apparatus we have for speech. Right? So the two develop together. The surprising thing is that despite that well-known fact, known at Vygotsky's time, he basically ignored speech up until about 1931. Right? Because it is a fact that the emergence of writing marked a polar, what's the word, a paradigm shift in human history. There we go. When people started writing things down for the most trivial reasons of the pharaohs wanting to keep account of how many sheep were owning or whatever. The Doomsday Book in England. I mean, what do you use? You mobilise the whole kingdom to write a book, and what do you write? A list of all your possessions, But that's actually how writing first emerged, mostly. But speech was already telling the stories of a bit of aphasia going on here. Epic. You had epic poems and all these things going on in speech. That's not what started writing. But nevertheless, so writing had its own origins, its own purposes, separately from speech. And it of course does mark a major turning point in the development of human history. Right? But Vygotsky at a certain point basically let that go. He had a short life, and the thing that had to be done was this issue of thinking and speech. And there was one of a number of tasks. Now, in saying that, I have to make a point clear here. Vygotsky is not just someone that's on about language. Right? he wrote prolifically about a complete range of psychological problems: child development, epilepsy, deafness, disability, personal development, attention, will, emotion, all these things. He wrote prolifically about them all. But he made an important discovery that if you want to solve a complex problem, just pick one problem and solve that well. Right? So he picked the relationship of speech and thinking, and he solved that problem really well. And he made an exemplar. And actually the meaning of the word paradigm is an exemplar. It's after Kuhn wrote his book, the word paradigm took on a certain meaning, of a whole matrix of concepts and actions that made up the science, right? But the original meaning of the word paradigm is an outstanding exemplar. So thought and language is a paradigm, or what's another similar word? Para something. What's the word? Para. No, I can't remember it. It's an outstanding example. There's a para word in there for paragon.
Paragon?
Paragon? Yeah, paragon. That's it. It's a paragon. Yeah. Also a paradigm. Okay, so I'm following Vygotsky in dealing with the words that he developed around thinking and speech. And I'm really skating over the question of attention, will, formation. I'm not even touching child development, any of these things, because we can get these concepts straight, and we're mostly dealing with fairly fundamental concepts under the question of thinking and speech. But it's not a question that Vygotsky is just someone that thinks it's all about words. It's certainly all about the use of artifacts. It's the artifacts now taken in the most general sense, which Vygotsky writes against. He said he's not happy about this word artifact, which lumps signs and tools together. And I'm actually lumping speech in with it as well, because he says, oh, you're just doing this to make nice, simple classifications. But you shouldn't lump things together in this way. Right? So speech is different from signs. Look, we had speech from the beginning of humanity. Signs came along only, let us say, writing only maybe 10,000 years ago, or was it less? So it's about 3,500 years ago. Clearly, writing is something quite different from speech. Child learns to speak, but when it learns to write, a complete transformation takes place in the psyche. So they're different things. Tools, like the computers we have, the cars, the way they completely change our lives is different from the way speech or writing changes our lives. So these are different things. But what the common theme to what Vygotsky does is he looks at how actions are mediated. And in that is completely in line with Hegel, who says that everything is mediated. Right? And it's the way he turned this perception that everything was mediated, and mediated not just in a general vague sense, but by things, but by things with a beginning and end and a size and a shape. Things are mediated, like words. I know they're a bit ephemeral, but they have a time span and a loudness. They're physical things, spoken words, right? So when he's talking about mediated by artifacts, this is a very specific thing. You can say, oh, the argument between Essendon and the AFL is being mediated by some court or something. Okay, that's a legitimate use of the word mediate. But Vygotsky uses mediation and artifact mediation in a very specific sense. And if we're going to get the sort of precision and psychological insights, it's best to restrict talk about mediation and sign mediation and artifacts to these meanings. And I just don't like people referring to talking about, for instance, Vygotsky's psychology is a good tool for education. I mean, it's actually perfectly good English. There's nothing actually wrong with that. But it's important to know exactly what is mediating an action. Right? For instance, I'm speaking English. So it's important that I'm using certain physical things, words in a certain language, to understand the operation that's going on here. If I just say I talk to people and neglect the fact that I use language on the assumption that other people will understand them, it's important, I would miss out that issue. When you choose to use certain words to put across your point, you are choosing something you inherited from the culture that other people will know about through their own interaction with that word, and there's actually a very complicated lot of interactions going on there every time you use a word. And you only get that if you understand the action of speaking is an artifact-mediated action or interaction. Okay? That artifact being a word that's chosen out of a language which may or may not be known to the person you're talking to. And if known, may be known in a way quite different from the way you know it. Okay. So we're going to skip over this quite quickly. Psychological tools and technical tools. We're all clear on this, I think, because we discussed it even last week. Okay? That doesn't include the spoken word, in the sense, because the psychological tool and technical tool are terms that Vygotsky introduced, and he didn't mean by them words, but I'm including words there under artifacts, and they're clearly signs. Okay? Because their words are for acting on the mind. So in a sense, although it's stretching the terminology, a word is a psychological tool. Okay? Psychological tools, by the way, are not elements of psychology. They're not figments of the mind. They are material things, just as are technical tools, but they're directed at changing the mind. So a psychological tool is like a map. Because it doesn't change the thing it's mapping. A map of England does not change England, but it will help you darn well to find your way around it. Yeah? Now, all artifacts are both material and ideal. So I'm just clarifying here three words. What I mean by artifact, so here a word is an artifact, as are computers, as are tools. These are all artifacts. That is to say they're products of human labour used in human labour. You also get to unusual things. Well, what about the constellations of the zodiac? Are they artifacts? Well, they are. Because even though no human hand ever touched the stars, the way that they have been picked out and given meaning, even though they're absolutely remote from human labour, makes them an artefact. Because it is in the nature of all artefacts that they are part of nature. And how we incorporate them in human labour is sometimes very clever. We can incorporate the stars into human labour through navigation or fortune telling without actually touching them, but that makes them artefacts. Okay? Because of the way that they're bits of nature and we use them. So that's why we say they are both material and ideal. They're material because they're not just in our mind, they're out there in the world, obedient to all the laws of nature. They crumble away and, disappear, get eaten by ants, all sorts of things. Right? They're material things, obedient to all the laws of nature, and they're ideal. Now, this word ideal, it's a word that's been given particular meaning by Ilyenkov, Eval Ilyenkov. What ideal means is that it has social significance. So the value of a commodity is an ideal. There's nothing about the chemistry or physics of this mobile phone that tells you it's worth $100. Right? Nothing at all. The $100 value of it isn't be worth 1 cent actually, but still, the value of it is entirely a social phenomenon. It's an ideal. Right? And the meaning of a word is an ideal. It's not contained in the physics of speech. It's a social product. So when bits of nature appear to take on human powers and act and participate in human affairs, that's because they're ideals. And things are both material and ideal. Material and ideal are not opposites. This is not a dichotomy. All artifacts are both material and ideal, but their properties can be said to be an ideal property, like the value, whereas the weight could be said to be a material property. But don't get too much into making a dichotomy of that, because of course the weight has to be measured on a weighing machine, which is itself a product of the industry, etc., etc. Okay. Now, something about artifact mediation. Mediation doesn't mean that the X on that triangle comes in between A and B. You can have mediation, say if the Palestinians and Israelis are talking to each other, you'll have like the American president comes along, talks to the Palestinians, talks to the Israelis, and then comes back and what these guys said and so on, right? So they don't ever sit in the same room together. So mediation can be used in that sense. So you could say that all our modern life has separated us from nature. We live in this constructed nature, we don't live in a real nature, right? So there is a certain sense and truth that our artifacts that we have made come between us and nature. But it's important to see that the reality is that if A is a person and B an object that they're looking at, and X is a sign representing to A, B, X is the sign for B, known to A to be the sign for B, right? Then when A looks at B, then they see also the sign, right? So, and when they look at the sign, they see the thing. So they're getting both stimulations together. So for example, I come dressed in sort of casual wear, right? You can't see me other than what I'm wearing, right? That would be shocking in itself, right? But you get the stimulation, the kind of symbolism I chose when I selected what clothing I'd wear to come along today, and you get me, right? So you get the immediate visual impression of human being Andy, and you get the various signs I've adopted to try and present myself, and you get the same, right? If I look at this bottle, I get all its social significance. I really hated buying this, because I just hate the whole idea of buying, but I didn't have a plastic bottle I could use, so I had to buy one, and I can recycle it next week. But I get all that all the signs, social significance, the ideals, as well as a material object. Right? So when I look at this product of human art, there's dual stimulation happening there. I'm getting two impressions. I'm getting all the social significance, like be smart, a plastic bottle of water, help someone get rich, pollute the environment, and something refreshing. Okay? So we have to get down to the good business here. The word meaning is the central concept of Vygotsky's main book, Thinking and Speech. He uses a number of different expressions to say the same thing. He sometimes refers to a meaningful word, for example. And he gets around the difficulty of putting across a new and unusual concept by putting it in half a dozen different ways, which has problems in itself. I'm going to say a meaningful word is an action. He says no, because at Vygotsky's time, he used action exclusively to mean action mediated with a tool. And he simply used that word action as something that wasn't a sign-mediated action, right? But there's lots of good reasons to say we get the spirit of what Vygotsky was saying by insisting that a meaningful word is an action, because it has all the properties of an action. Okay. When we are doing this thing, which is our action, we can't do it without mediation. If I want to convey to someone that I really don't like them, well, actually I've got all sorts of ways of doing it, haven't I? Snarl, show my teeth, poke my tongue out, right? But I can use a word. Right? if I wanted to tell them something a bit more subtle than I didn't like them, I'd certainly need words to do that. Okay, so a word meaning is an action. So it's a basic unit of human activity, particularly one that it's not just any old activity, it's speech activity. Right? So the title of the book is not Thought and Language, it's Thinking and Speech. So he's talking about activity, actions. His approach to psychology and human life is one in which we are active beings. Right? So a word is not something found in a dictionary. As I said, solve one problem and do it properly. He didn't decide to analyse a dictionary. He's a psychologist. He analysed not even writing. He took the spoken word which has been there with us since human beings came into existence, and he analysed that. Right? So a spoken word is an action. It can't be anything other than an action, unless you want to say an action is something other than a spoken word, right? But it's active. It's a doing of something. What is it doing? It's affecting other people. If I say something, it has an effect on you. It affects your mind. It may thereby affect your body. If you think, oh, this person is talking such utter crap, I'm going to get out and leave, then it's affected your body, but only immediately through your mind. So it's a sign, it's a special case of a sign-mediated action, but it's an archetypal one. It's a paradigm, it's the exemplar, it's the primary exemplar, it's the archetype of a sign-mediated action. Now, for instance, my choice of clothes is a sign-mediated action as well. But, you know, it's a very marginal one. You won't learn a lot of that. But it's in the same category. The gestures I make, like why am I doing this with my hands? That's part of what I'm doing, right? It's part of my act of conveying a meaning. But the paradigm of human activity, and really all human activity, it turns out, is a meaningful word. That action where we utter a word. Now the great thing about word meaning as a sign-mediated action is that the word we use is not something we invent ourselves. I can make a gesture, right? But unless that kind of waving of the hand has some meaning to you that you've picked up culturally, it might be meaningless. But words, I can't really invent a word. I have to pull that out of an existing culture. So if I go back to that little triangle, we've got it there. See, the great thing about the triangle, imagine X is a word. I'm A, you're B, and X is a word that I've uttered to you. But in that little triangle, we have two human beings in interaction, and doing that interaction is the whole cultural world. Yeah? Where I pick a word that has thousands of, let's say hundreds of years of history behind it. History which includes big political battles, arguments, invasions. For instance, I might choose to use an Anglo-Saxon word instead of a Latin word. And that way, I'm still fighting the Battle of Hastings. You with me? You know this thing about Churchill's speech, that we will fight them on the beaches, we will fight them on the landing places. And the whole thing is all Anglo-Saxon words, except for the last one, the word surrender, which is a Latin word. But those French may do it, right? But we English, we will fight them, and we will, you know. And that's so guttural when you realise that for instance, I had a lot of time in the union movement, you know, dealing with manual workers and so on, a big part of my life experience. And it's still the case. You use a Latin word and you're nominating yourself as a member of the French elite that took over England in 1066. Right? So in a word, the whole, thousands of years of history are contained in there. When you utter a word to somebody else, you bring all that history to bear in the relationship between the two of you. Now, so there's a unit of analysis for you. Right? to take a meaningful word is not just a unit of analysis for consciousness, but it like encapsulates entire sort of social history, doesn't it? When two people have an interaction between them and it's mediated by a word chosen from language, a product of centuries of history. Like in the simple thing of whether it has a Latin or an Anglo-Saxon etymology, says things. Right? And of course all words have connotations. You know, like that expression you used, Jenny, which, what was it again? Meaning making. I mean, that word sort of grates on me, meaning making. Because this way of putting ing on the end of the words, it comes from a certain kind of academia, right, which I sort of have silly issues with personally. It's nothing really, but that's contained there when you say meaning making. That conjures up all sorts of interactions with people I've known. But, so this is going on all the time when we use a word. Right? And so when Vygotsky chose word meaning as a unit of analysis for making a study of the intellect, it was a good choice because it was a microcosm, in a sense, or a unit for a much larger thing.
Now, when you were speaking, I was wondering whether there is any relation between the synchronic and the diachronic in Saussure and the sign with its consequences.
Yeah, so it's synchronic meaning analysing the structure of things as it's happening now, diachronic looking at things historically.
Yes, and also the signifier and the signified, which used both like signs, meanings, and the materiality of the word.
Look, Saussurean linguistics doesn't fit very well with Jack. Peircean semiotics fits fairly well. Okay. Basically, the idea of there being two worlds with signified and signifiers creates a kind of dichotomous world, which, in the space that Vygotsky is coming from, is not helpful because he's all about mediation. And the Saussurean approach tends to rule out concept of mediation. Peircean, or Persian, I think is the way it's supposed to be pronounced, Charles Sanders Peirce, is semiotics. Peircean, is it? I say Peircean.
I'm American, I say Peirce.
You say Peirce, well I'll go with that. Persian sounds so pretentious to me. Peircean semiotics works very well. One, because it's very objective, and two, because it's based on a triangle of mediation. Right. So if you don't know about Peircean semiotics, don't worry about it. But if you are into semiotics and semiology and so on, then, as I say, Saussurean doesn't fit very well with this work. It's a different take on the world. You know? But if you like Peirce, it'll go very well. Okay, and any other, before I move on from this? Yes?
Well, I'm interested there in where we had word meaning, but also the intention of the person using those words. So if a person uses the word mutton, an Anglo-Saxon word, or the word lamb, which is a French Norman word, it's not really the intention for there to be this whole cultural sort of
That's
thing.
right.
But if, for instance, when you were a Welsh person, we use an Anglo-Saxon word, being generally of my people, that kind of thing, can come out. So there often is in Wales a very political meaning behind the use of a word in using a Welsh word that's based on English, or a Welsh word that was there long before the English came. So there is a political thing. So where do you see then who is making the meaning and the intention of the meaning? Is that meant to be, some people aren't intending for there to be a meaning like that, but other people do.
A lot of the gender politics, my first job at the uni here, or one of the jobs I was in charge of these teaching spaces, all the equipment in them and things, right? And so the lecturer would get into trouble and they'd dial their phone, and a young technician who might be a year out of their diploma at RMIT or something, would rush in to help them. And they were not academics. They didn't have the language skills. And sometimes you have lecturers humiliate these kids in front of a class. And that used to really wind me up, because someone who's not educated can say, as you say, all sorts of terrible things, right? And they may have ideas there, which are ideas which one would want to get rid of and train them out of, but they don't have the language skills, they don't know that they're using a word which is going to give offence to somebody. It's just the word they use, right? And they can get into terrible trouble having no idea what's happening to them and be totally humiliated in a situation there, right? So the fact that we are part of social struggles, that's the fact. And you can be an innocent participant in those, that's a fact as well. Soldiers are sent out to war without knowing what the hell they're fighting for and get killed, that's a fact. Someone who's been uneducated in gender politics can find themselves in a hell of a fight because they said the wrong thing. That's a fact. That's human life. We are engaged in things that we don't necessarily understand. It's great if you do know all the connotations behind the word you're going to use before you use it, right? That requires education and training, that's all. So you people would doubtless, I think, be pretty proficient in that stuff. You'll know all the connotations behind the words you're using when you're uttering them. But as you quite rightly say, not everyone does. Some words are very political in one context, not in another. Yeah? That's the beauty of this unit of analysis, that takes two people and all of the political world outside is captured in the fact that they use an artifact to mediate their interaction. There's a fellow called Alexander Mershchikov who ran a school for deaf-blind children in the Soviet Union, right? Deaf and blind, there's a disability for you. And children would come to them who had no human interaction at all. No interaction with, they were blind and deaf, so that all they had was touch. And they would come into the school non-human, really. There was nothing human about them. And the education process was getting them to eat their food with a spoon. And they wouldn't really know how to use a spoon, so it was the moment when they took the food off the spoon, where they participated by they'll be fed by somebody else when they did the movement that went, and that would be the beginning of their education. That artifact, the spoon, represented civilization, that we don't eat like this on the floor, we sit at table at a certain time, we use knife, fork and spoon and so on. And they would have to learn that from the beginning. They wouldn't just see things happening around them and absorb it. So that's why this business of being very precise about what we mean by a tool is important, because a lot of things are going on around us that we're not necessarily aware of. So be precise about what actual material thing is mediating a particular interaction. So you might say, my teaching work is mediated by such and such a theory. No. It may be mediated by such and such a book you read, and then you got something out of that book. But I doubt it's the theory itself which is mediating your teaching practice. Right? How can the theory mediate? In a general sort of way of everyday speech, it can. But your practice will be mediated by more likely a book or perhaps another person, but not a theory. No, the theory can't exist other than in its written form in a book or in the words and actions of another person. Right? So I don't talk ever, well, no, you can say, I never say never. I'm likely to say almost anything. But in this context, I shouldn't be talking about something being mediated by a theory. That's going to be mediated by a thing, a person, a body part, a book, or something. Right? A spoken word, a written word, a hand gesture. Okay? And then you see, well, where did that artifact come from? What's its background? What's its source? What are the implications and connections behind that? So human interaction then becomes a material thing, a material process, connected with the material world through the artifact that we choose, which is a material thing.
See, just on that slide, Vygotsky's book called Thinking in Speech and mediated by sound, but you can have words and language without sound.
Yes.
So how does that?
Because Vygotsky's
taking
he's doing solve one problem, solve it properly. And what you learn through Vygotsky's analysis of thinking and speech, you'll easily be able to extend to cover gestures, passing notes, body language, and so on and so forth. Right? So instead of trying to give a theory of everything and write the book on human life, he takes one problem and solves it well. He makes an exemplar. So thinking and speech is how to solve that one very specific problem. But there's a hell of a lot in it as it happens. But if you're interested in the language of gestures, for example, deaf children raised by hearing parents who choose not to teach them sign language, how do those kids develop? But by keeping their eyes open and watching gestures and movements, for example. So it's very important in that context. But you wouldn't expect to open thinking and speech and find the answer to that, but you'll find a good paradigm for the method of approaching that problem. Can I click on? I just want to make this point. I've said that speech is an action, or a word, a spoken word is an action. So is perception. There's an article by Dewey called The Reflex Art, where he makes this point really well. He says the behaviourists have stimulus reaction, right? You get a stimulus and you react to it. He says, but stimulus and reaction is going on all the time. Stimulus, reaction, stimulus, reaction, stimulus, reaction. There's a continuous circle. And you're just stopping the circle at one point and connecting the stimulus to the reaction. He said, but it's really, if you're going to take half of the circle, it's better to take your action first. And then if something happens that's unexpected, then you'll get a stimulus from it. If when you do something, the results of that is just as expected, then there'll be no stimulus at all. But if something unexpected happened, then that's a result of your action, and it feeds back on your consciousness that led to that action. Right? So the very act of seeing and feeling and hearing is actually an action. We're not just like this microphone here, some passive thing that picks up and the sound waves goes in and it falls away. Because you know the cocktail party problem. You could go to a cocktail party and there's an absolute cacophony of voices going on, and someone on the other side of the room mentions your name. And, yeah, what was that? I'm over here, you know. But you actively filter and select what you see. And there's all sorts of lovely psychological problems that are going into how, of this business, like you write, take a bit of writing and you mess up all the letters of the words in between the first and the last letter of the word, and you can read it perfectly well, even though actually when you stop and look at it, it's total nonsense, which just shows that the perception is an act. When we perceive something, we have already a consciousness about what it is we're doing, and we actively go out and grab information and build that up. Right? So all of Vygotsky's work is based on actions, not dumb instruments that are passive recipients of stimuli. Everything is action and produces a result, and so it goes on. Okay? So just summing up, this concept of artifact mediation, it's the key to the cultural formation of the mind, because everything that has gone on for the thousands of years before us that brought us here is contained in the material culture that we've inherited. And by placing the objects from that material culture between us and seeing and understanding the communication between people is using those artifacts from the material culture that's gone before us, makes us understand how our day-to-day life interaction is made possible through the culture and activity of all of those that have gone before us. Wonderful, that little image of two people facing each other holding an artifact, right? That encapsulates the whole thing, doesn't it? because that's a kind of unit of analysis. Slightly generalised from meaningful word, it's using it here a meaningful artefact, the golden key of knowledge. Oh yeah, I had here a link just to talk about word and deed again. In the beginning was the deed, right? Tool making. Out of that arose language. But so you had two different processes going on there. The production of artifacts like buildings, technology of various kinds, which then changes the scope and kind of activity that's going on. But that happens only through the use of language. You're never going to get beyond the hunter-gatherer kind of lifestyle unless you develop the language that's capable of organising things at large scale division of labour, the legal system and so on. So the development of verbal culture, let's say the culture of signs and words, has to go hand in hand with the development of a technical culture, technique, and they continually interact with each other. So for example, the printing press, the archetypal or the paradigm of the sign, was a product of technology. You couldn't have a printing press until certain achievements of technology were put together. The people that built water wheels would probably have contributed towards the creation of a printing press. I don't know the history of the invention of a printing press, to tell the truth. I should have looked into it before coming here and making rash statements. But you can see how the tool there, which was a psychological tool, a printing press, that had an enormous impact on the development of thinking and verbal activity, immediately grew out of the development of technique. And then, of course, you have the development of the sciences, which then changed technique. Right? So you have the interlocking development of language and technique, and the kind of words we use. And I was listening to, anyone ever watch QI? I knew I do, I watched QI. Right? And they had a thing last night about the robin redbreast, whose breast is obviously orange and not red, because at the time the bird was named, red was not a colour. Red is quite, apparently, according to what's his name, it's a recent discovery. And I do know that the words have entered the different languages over a long period of time. I thought red actually, orange, sorry, red entered, red entered early. They didn't have a word for orange until quite recently. Beg your pardon. Red is one of the early ones. Black and white come in early. Red's quite high. Blue doesn't come in after thousands of years, right? Because the development of technique was required before the words. So you have to be able to produce a blue dye and able to make blue before you recognise blue as a thing. This is the same colour as the sky, right? So in Homer's writing, you never hear about a blue sea. The sea is red, in fact. But in the Egyptian society, they did have a way of making blue dye, and blue entered their language. And the entry of the word orange into the English language is quite a recent thing. Therefore, robin redbreasts actually have orange breasts. Right? So what the hell was the point of that story? Oh yeah, just to show the interconnected development of thinking and speech. Yeah, that you can't just say that the way we act and talk and think today is the product of the technology, because the technology is also a product of thinking, of science and verbal culture. The two, language and technique, have developed in a kind of a spiral. Right? Necessary to distinguish them before we can have an insight like that. The development of thinking through the development of language has to be distinguished from the development of technique itself before you can look at the interaction of them. And that's basically the point that Vygotsky is making there. Now, just how much time have I got? Yeah, I've got 10 minutes. Dual stimulation. I've explained earlier that in that diagram, B, which might be the bear here, stimulates the A, who's an observer looking at this bear. X, the little label that the bear's holding, which is a sign also. So you look at that picture and you see a big grizzly bear holding a sign saying teddy bear. So you're getting these two things together. So how you react to the bear is going to be possibly influenced by the sign, the bit of social significance that you're giving there. Now, this idea is not completely unique to Vygotsky. But what Vygotsky did, which is absolutely unique, and marks him out from, for instance, the American pragmatists that had a lot of the same ideas as him at the same time, is that he turned this insight into a laboratory technique. A lot of people like Wundt in Germany, late 19th century Germany, understood that psychology would have to take account of politics and art and literature, or it would be a rat shit psychology. Any psychology that was based on measuring reaction times, or colour, discriminating colour, these kind of things you did in a laboratory, that couldn't understand what was beautiful about the Mona Lisa, or why people vote for Tony Abbott, would be a useless kind of psychology. So Wundt understood that. John Dewey found a lot of the insights and further developed that, including the idea of actions mediated by culture and so on. But what Vygotsky got was how you can use dual stimulation as a laboratory technique. What this means is that you have a subject that is trying to solve a problem, and it's important that they are already trying to solve the problem. Okay, this is the starting point. Subject trying to solve a problem. Child trying to read, having difficulty. Child trying to work out what the sum of 2 and 2 is, what it might be. And then the experimenter, the representative of the wider culture, comes in, offers them a sign. It gives them, here's a little memory card, why don't you use that and see if it'll help you remember the answer to this problem, right? And by doing that, it allows the experimenter, if that's what's going on, research, to actually construct an idea, to fashion consciousness, and to know the particular elements of culture that went into the formation of that element of consciousness, because they were provided. Now, this is a complete break from a scientific method as it is for anywhere else. According to the standard sort of psychological method up until recent times, is that the psychologist or the researcher has to keep himself out of the experiment, has to isolate the subject from any kind of social interaction, just leave them in a closed room like sensory deprivation, and then let them have some experiment, right? So you deprive someone of their humanity and then do experiments on them psychologically. Okay, so that's the sort of standard. Look, it's not like nowadays science is not quite as stupid as that, right? People have learned some lessons over the last sort of 50 years or so. Certainly in Vygotsky's time, for the experimenter to get actively involved in helping the subject solve a problem, instead of standing back and saying, oh, it took the subject 14 seconds to solve this problem, it took the subject 25 seconds to solve this one. To actually get in and help them solve it was like contrary to scientific method. Right? It's like the anthropologist that goes to observe some people living in a jungle and brings along a movie camera and shows them movies. I mean, you've destroyed the object. So the idea of psychological experimentation was taken in the same way. So it's part of the genetic method as well, because if you just say, here's someone has this certain ability, oh, that's great, where did it come from? You have to somehow or other track its coming into being in order to understand it, and the dual stimulation allows that to happen. Also, dual stimulation is insight into how we control our own behaviour. When children are little, they have to do what they're told. Right? Don't touch that; it's dirty. Don't put your hand in there; it's hot. Whatever. Put your toys away now. But there's a stage they go through whereby they instruct themselves. I'll go over and say, oh, that's dirty, don't touch that. Mustn't put my hand in there, that's hot. Right? They actually take over the role of commanding their behaviour from their parents. And then, of course, they get to a point where they don't bother saying that anymore. They actually just know not to put their hand in the fire or to roll around in the mud and to put their toys away when they're finished. Right? But the intermediate stage of taking control of their own behaviour happens by appropriating for themselves the words by which their parents control them. And that's another example of dual stimulation. They can't just adopt a new behaviour. They get to the behaviour in the first place by being told to do it by their parents. So the step towards doing that behaviour autonomously is to play the role of parent themselves and tell themselves what to do. Right? So this dual stimulation gives a fantastic insight into development and research experimentation, and it's possibly the most important contribution that Vygotsky made to science, I think. That scientist doesn't stand back and watch from a distance, but gets involved. So actually what you're talking about there is not just research, but education as well. Now we've just got a couple of minutes. We all okay on what an artifact is? Yeah? And I'd say a gesture is an artifact as well. The human body is an artifact. You know, it's the product of nature and civilization. If I'm free of disease and, you know, got a bit of a tummy, that's cultural product. Yeah? And all the things about me are signs. Yeah? So the human body is an artifact. Artifact of what? Of the culture we live in, the food we eat, the medicine we have, the exercise we do and don't do, our whole culture.
Mediator of what?
Of what?
Yeah.
Oh, so there's another meaning to the word artifact, right? If you're into image processing, for instance, I may be missing the boat here, but people will say, oh, that's an artifact of the method. Or if there's a red eye, for instance, you know, in photographs you have red eye, and that's an artifact. It wasn't in the object being photographed. It's a creation of the photographic process, and that's the meaning of the word artifact. But it's not the sense in which, quite the sense I'm using the word artifact here.
I thought the artifact was a mediator.
Yes.
Or what? That's a...
Oh, well, what is the human body a mediator of?
Exactly.
Oh, well, a hell of a lot. Yeah, when I'm communicating with you, for example, I'm using the human body with my gestures. I'm producing the words with my human body. Yeah, I distinguish myself from my body in saying this.
Is it a bit like Lacan saying that the body is overwritten with signifiers? And
Yeah, exactly. The same thought. Well, when discourse theorists talk about buildings being texts, right? Or when Pierre Bourdieu talks about texts, he's talking there about the human body as being basically a text. And I'm going, the text is used, when it's used in its most general sense, and the discourse theory which uses text as a concept is coming very close to what I mean by artifact. It's the same concept, really. Artifact mediation, then. Okay, we can mediate with things other than artifacts, but it's artifact mediation which is a special concept here.
You see that Dewey came up a few times, and he positive kind of ways. He sounds sympathetic to me.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. I find that partly it's the way he's being read, I think, and taken up, a bit like Vygotsky gets misread and taken up. But I think there's an overprivileging in the Dewey work about exactly what Vygotsky's contribution here was about that the other, you know, classically the more knowledgeable other, but it can be anyone from the culture, mediating and intervening and co-constructing a different way of development. I think the Deweyan, my reading of Dewey is there's an over-privileging of the subject experience. Do you know what I mean? Of how important that is.
Yeah.
I'm just interested in other perspectives.
No, I tend to read Dewey sympathetically, partly because otherwise all these ideas we have only in Russian, translation from the Russian, or translation from the German. So Dewey wrote voluminously over a long professional life, and he's very close to these ideas, and he wrote in English, and he wrote very well and clearly. So wherever I can find Dewey explaining an idea, then I'll grab that. I think he's fundamentally on the right side of history. He just didn't make the last couple of steps that Vygotsky made, and it's this question of dual stimulation is typical of that. I mean, he had his laboratory school, a wonderful thing to set up a school where he could study consciousness by actually giving kids a good education. Very very Vygotskian sort of idea. But there are problems with him, I agree.
You know, I'm just interested in other readings.
I don't understand how, given that Dewey ran schools, obviously the teachers are helping the students learn, so I don't see the difference between that approach and the Vygotsky approach, where the experimenter helps the student learn.
Yeah, exactly. And it wouldn't
like if Dewey didn't run schools, you could...
Well, just the one school, the laboratory school in Chicago. Yeah.
And there's different reports. I've heard different reports about how successful it was, but the fact he was running a school seemed to me, I can't see the difference between the approaches.
I'm saying that's something that Vygotsky would be very sympathetic with, but Russell's really raising the whole spread of his corpus of ideas, and I'm agreeing that you can't sort of take the whole of Dewey, but he's a writer that should be treated very sympathetically, and if you have a chance to read him, do. He's a good writer. It's got, that's all I'm saying. But we're doing Vygotsky, and Vygotsky at times is quite negative about Dewey, as if he has to draw a line between himself and Dewey.